Lonely widower takes in homeless mother and her newborn twins. Unaware, she will change his life. The winter was long and harsh in the quiet town of Belmere, where silence filled the spaces between wind and snow. In a small house that stood on the edge of a frozen meadow lived Thomas Reed, a widower whose heart had gone quiet the day he buried his wife, Emily. She had been the sun in his sky, and since her passing 3 winters ago, the warmth had vanished from his days. His world was now reduced to routines, feeding the chickens, stacking wood, boiling coffee he never finished. The fireplace crackled every night, but the warmth never reached his chest. He spent his evenings staring at half-built wooden toys, carvings he used to make with joy but now just shaped out of habit. Outside, the wind howled against the wooden walls, but Thomas rarely noticed anymore. His days passed in a kind of stillness that wasn't peace, just quietness that had forgotten how to be interrupted. But everything began to shift one late afternoon when the snow had started again. He had just returned from the barn when he heard something, barely a sound. Not quite a knock, more like a brush against the door. Curious, he opened it, half expecting the wind to be playing tricks again. But standing there, barely holding herself upright, was a young woman wrapped in a tattered coat, her eyes swollen from cold and tears. In her arms, bundled tightly against her chest, were 2 tiny infants, their faces flushed from the biting air. She didn't speak, not right away. Her lips trembled too much. But Thomas could see the plea in her eyes, in the way her knees shook, in the way she held her babies as if afraid someone would take them. He stepped aside without a word, letting her enter. She hesitated only for a moment, then stepped inside, her boots soaked and cracked from the snow, her breath shaky. The babies whimpered faintly, and she pulled them closer. Thomas closed the door and added a log to the fire. The flames danced to life, painting gold on the woman's pale face. She knelt near the hearth, rubbing the baby's feet gently as they stirred. Thomas stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Then he walked to the kitchen and poured hot water into a mug, adding a pinch of tea leaves. He handed it to her without asking anything. She took it with both hands and nodded once. The house was quiet except for the crackling fire and the soft sounds of 2 newborns breathing. After some time, the woman finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse and low. She said her name was Grace. The twins were Leo and Lily. She had been walking for days. Her car broke down 2 towns away, and she had nowhere left to go. Thomas only nodded. He didn't ask about the father or what had brought her to such desperation. He saw enough in the way she sat, exhausted, guarded, but still somehow holding on. He brought her a blanket from the spare room and laid it across her shoulders. She thanked him with a whisper. That night, she and the baby slept near the fire while Thomas stayed in his chair, not because he didn't trust her, but because it had been so long since someone else had breathed inside these walls. He watched her for a while, how she slept lightly, waking at the faintest cry, how her hands moved with tenderness when she soothed the twins. He couldn't remember the last time the house had felt so full, yet so quiet. By morning, the snow had covered the porch in a thick white blanket. The sun peeked over the ridge, pale and slow. Grace was already awake, rocking Lily gently while Leo lay beside her on the rug. Her coat was draped over a chair, drying by the fire. Thomas handed her a bowl of oatmeal and a soft slice of bread. She ate slowly, carefully, as if every bite had to last. The baby stirred again, and she cradled them while eating, not missing a beat. He noticed her face had softened a little. Less fear, more exhaustion. The house no longer felt empty. The crib in the attic, built long ago for a child who never came, suddenly seemed like something that might be needed after all. Grace didn't ask for anything, but she accepted help without pride or shame. That day, Thomas cleared the small back room, making space for her and the twins. He found clean sheets, an old rocking chair, and even a box of baby clothes Emily had bought during a hopeful time that never turned into more. Grace looked at the clothes and held one tiny hat in her hands for a long time, her eyes watery, but she said nothing. Days passed. The storm outside lingered, but inside, the walls began to carry warmth again. Grace didn't talk much about her past, but Thomas learned little things from her silences. He saw how she kept the baby's bottles clean, how she folded every blanket tightly, how she whispered lullabies that came from a place deeper than memory. And every time she smiled at her children, it was like watching a wound slowly closing. Thomas hadn't laughed in years, but the first time Lily burped loudly and Leo burst into a surprised wail, something strange and sudden escaped his lips. A small chuckle. Grace looked up, surprised, and for a moment, they both smiled. Just a flicker, but it stayed with him. The house smelled of stew and warm milk now, instead of cold dust and ash. There was laundry hanging near the fire, bottles lined up by the window, a pink sock tucked into a chair cushion. Evidence of life, of presence, of belonging. Thomas found himself chopping wood longer each morning, just to think. He didn't know what this was becoming, only that it felt different. Not fast, not loud, just slow, steady, like the first signs of spring under frozen ground. He didn't ask her to stay, not yet, but he hoped she would. And Grace, though she said little, started to move through the house like someone who was learning not to run. There was no talk of leaving, no mention of the road, just the quiet rhythm of two people who had been broken in different ways, slowly finding breath in the same space. The snow outside softened over the next few days, losing its sharp edge as the wind began to quiet. Inside the house, the shift was even more noticeable. Grace had found a rhythm with the space, moving through rooms with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't own the place but respected every corner of it. She swept the floors in the morning while the babies napped, boiled water for tea, folded towels Thomas hadn't touched in months. She didn't ask for permission to help. She simply did it with the kind of care that made the old house feel alive again. Thomas noticed small things at first, the way she added herbs to the soup, how she organized the pantry without being told, how she picked up a worn photo frame that had been face down on the shelf and set it upright again. It was a picture of Emily, faded now, her smile faint but familiar. Grace didn't comment, only offered a quiet glance before turning back to the babies. Leo and Lily grew more alert with each day. Their tiny faces now recognized the sound of Grace's hums and the warmth of the fire. Thomas found himself drawn to them more than he expected. He would sit nearby as Grace fed them, sometimes offering to hold one while she changed the other. The first time he cradled Leo, he felt unsure and stiff, afraid he might do something wrong. But the baby simply blinked at him, then closed his eyes with trust. It was such a small thing, yet Thomas carried the feeling for hours afterward. He had not held a child in years. He had not held hope in even longer. Grace watched him sometimes, her eyes quiet but observant. She noticed how he moved slower when near the twins, how he would pause what he was doing just to listen to their breathing, how he tucked the extra quilt around them even when the fire was warm enough. The days settled into gentle routine. Morning brought tea and soft cries, midday brought warm stew or thick bread, evening brought the smell of wood smoke and the soft creak of the old rocking chair. Grace had begun humming again, not loud but often, and her voice seemed to settle the whole room. At night, after the twins had fallen asleep in the room Thomas had given her, she would sit near the fire and stitch loose hymns or rest with her eyes half closed. Thomas often sat nearby, whittling pieces of wood into shapes that were slowly turning into animals, blocks, or little toys he hadn't made in years. He hadn't intended to make them for the babies, but they began to look like gifts, soft and rounded at the edges, meant for small hands. One night, without thinking, he placed a wooden elephant on the table near Grace's tea mug. She didn't say anything, only smiled faintly and placed it beside the twins' crib. Spring pressed gently against the windows with soft thaws and longer daylight. Thomas opened the back porch again, letting air move through the house, not cold anymore, but fresh, new. Grace washed the baby's clothes and hung them near the door, tiny shirts fluttering beside his work shirts. One afternoon, Thomas returned from the shed to find her planting something in the old garden patch behind the house. He hadn't touched the soil in years, not since Emily's tulips turned to weeds. But now Grace knelt there, sleeves rolled, her hands deep in the earth, planting herbs and small vegetables from a packet she had found tucked in a drawer. She didn't ask if she could. She simply looked up at him, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and said it would help stretch their food a little more. Thomas nodded and brought her a spade without a word. They did not talk much about the past. Grace never mentioned where she came from beyond that broken car and the empty road. But one evening, when the babies had gone quiet and the wind had slowed, she sat near the hearth and stared into the flames longer than usual. Her eyes were heavy. She said softly, not looking at Thomas, that she had once lived in a city far from here, with a man who changed the moment she told him she was pregnant. She had tried to make it work, tried to stay strong. But some storms you walk into alone. Thomas didn't interrupt. He only listened. She said she left because she wanted her children to grow somewhere they could breathe without fear. Then she went quiet again, and the only sound was the fire. That night, Thomas didn't sleep well. He kept thinking of what it meant to carry children across winter roads with no home waiting. What it meant to be that afraid and keep walking. He thought of Emily, how they had dreamed of a family once. Thought of the cradle they had built and stored away when hope had faded. He didn't go to the attic to look for it. Not yet. But he remembered where it was. The next day, while Grace was bathing Lily in the kitchen basin and Leo slept nearby, Thomas walked into town. It was the first time in weeks he had left them alone. The sun was warmer now, the sky pale blue, and the dirt road had begun to show under the melting snow. At the general store, he bought a new blanket, soft and thick, and a small rattle carved from cedar. The shopkeeper raised a brow but didn't ask questions. Thomas hadn't bought anything for a child in years. When he returned, Grace was in the backyard with the twins in a basket beside her, resting under the shade of the porch. She looked up at him with a smile that didn't seem forced anymore. He handed her the blanket and set the rattle beside Leo, who stirred at the sound. Grace's smile faded for a second, replaced by something softer, something almost like relief. She didn't thank him out loud. She didn't need to. That evening, while the baby slept, she placed the new blanket inside the crib and sat beside it for a long time, just watching them. As the weeks passed, the house took on a rhythm that Thomas had forgotten was possible. The porch was swept, the pantry fuller, the sounds inside the walls changed. No longer just echoes, but voices, footsteps, the gentle weight of life returned. Grace had brought no promises, only her presence. But that had changed everything. And though no words had been spoken yet about staying, Thomas found himself hoping that she already had. Spring unfolded slowly across Belmere. The air carried the scent of wet soil and waking trees, and the hillsides wore a faint green where snow had melted away. Inside the house, change had rooted itself not in grand gestures, but in the steady weight of ordinary days. Thomas found himself rising earlier, drawn to the sound of the baby's soft murmurs and Grace's gentle humming from the kitchen. The mornings were filled with the smell of porridge and the crackle of fresh firewood. Grace often stood by the window as she fed Lily or burped Leo, her eyes drifting across the horizon like someone learning to trust the sky again. The back garden had begun to sprout. Small green shoots poked through the soil where Grace had planted seeds weeks ago. Thomas had offered to help tend them, and though he didn't say it, it felt like tending something much more than vegetables. Each sprout was a kind of promise that life, once lost, could begin again. The twins were growing stronger by the day. Their cries came louder now, but so did their smiles. Leo had a habit of clutching Thomas's fingers with surprising strength, while Lily would stare at the light through the curtains with wide, curious eyes. Thomas had made each of them a small wooden animal. One a bear, the other a fox, and placed them by their crib. Grace had smiled when she saw them, a real smile that stayed even after she looked away. The house now held signs of them everywhere, tiny socks on the chairs, bottles drying on the rack, soft blankets draped over furniture once left untouched. Grace had begun baking bread once a week, and the smell filled the rooms with a kind of peace that reminded Thomas of a time long before the silence settled in. She didn't speak much about what came before Belmere, but the way she folded the baby's clothes, the way she tucked them in at night, said enough. She had lost much, but not her ability to love. One evening, Thomas sat on the porch, watching the twins nap in a basket beside him. Grace was inside folding laundry. The sky was painted in soft gold and lavender, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. As he looked down at the two small faces sleeping without fear, he realized something had shifted inside him. This place, once a shell of old memories, had become full again, not with noise or crowds, but with breath, warmth, and belonging. He thought of Emily then, not with the ache he once carried, but with a quiet gratitude. She had loved this house. She had dreamed of children here. And now, somehow, in a way he could never have expected, life had returned. But peace is rarely left untouched for long. It was late afternoon when the knock came, sharp and sudden. Grace had been on the porch with Lily in her arms when she froze. Thomas stepped beside her instinctively. A man stood at the gate, dressed too clean for the road, his coat pressed and boots polished. His eyes were cold and sharp, his posture full of certainty. Behind him stood another man in uniform, holding a folder. Grace's face turned pale. Thomas didn't need to ask. He knew. The man at the gate introduced himself as Marcus Hale, Grace's former partner and father of the twins. He spoke in clipped words, explaining that he had come to reclaim his children. The officer beside him remained silent, but his presence was loud enough. Grace's hands tightened around Lily. Thomas moved in front of them both, not angry, just steady. Marcus held up papers, temporary custody granted by a distant court, stamped and signed. He said he had rights, and he had come to take what was his. Inside the house, Leo began to cry. Grace didn't move. She stared at Marcus with eyes that held more steel than fear. Thomas reached for the papers, scanned them, and exhaled slowly. He told the men they could wait while the matter was taken to the county court. He knew the law, had learned enough after Emily's passing to understand how systems worked. Marcus didn't like that. He said he would return with more authority. Grace said nothing as the two men walked away, but her hands didn't stop shaking until long after the gate had closed. The following days were heavy with worry. Grace moved through the house with focus but little rest. She watched the twins like a hawk, waking at the slightest sound, checking locks twice, folding and refolding clothes. Thomas gave her space, but stayed close. At night, when the babies slept, she would sit by the fire and stare at the flames, silent. Thomas brought out the old cradle from the attic one evening and placed it near the hearth. Grace touched it gently, her fingers tracing its smooth edges, and for the first time in days, her shoulders dropped just slightly. They both knew the storm wasn't over, but they also knew they wouldn't face it alone. The court hearing came quickly. The judge was firm but fair. Marcus argued with papers and claims, but the people of Belmere showed up. The shopkeeper who had seen Grace walk through the snow, the neighbor who had watched Thomas carry milk to the babies each morning, the pastor who had seen them all grow into something close to family. Grace spoke once, her voice clear but quiet. She said she had walked away from the man who left her alone in winter because she chose safety for her children over promises broken too many times. Thomas stood after her, speaking not with grand words but with quiet truth. He said he had found peace again in the sound of tiny feet and Grace's hum, and that no paper could change what had been built under his roof. The judge listened, asked few questions, and finally gave his ruling. Full custody to Grace. No further appeal. Marcus left the courthouse without a word, his eyes bitter but beaten. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds as Grace held the twins close. She turned to Thomas, her expression soft but unsure. He didn't speak. He only offered his hand, and she took it without hesitation. They walked home together in silence. That evening, Grace stood by the window with Leo in her arms and Lily asleep nearby. The wind outside was soft, the sky darkening with spring dusk. Thomas placed the last piece of carved wood on the mantel, a small bird with open wings. The fire crackled behind them. The house, once a shelter for grief, now stood full with breath, with laughter, with small socks and baby cries, with something growing stronger than either of them had expected. Grace turned from the window and looked at Thomas. In that moment, she didn't see rescue. She saw a place she could belong. And Thomas, who once thought his days of love had ended, saw not a second chance, but a new beginning.